Welcome to what I consider the pinnacle of English listening practice. I'm Olivia, and this is episode 91 of English Learning Podcast, specifically crafted for advanced learners who refuse to settle for anything less than mastery. Today's challenge isn't for the faint-hearted. We're diving into the deep end of English comprehension, the kind of listening that separates proficient speakers from those who truly command the language. If you're operating at C1 or C2 level, or aspiring to reach those heights, you've found your training ground. Over the next hour, you'll encounter English as it exists in the most demanding professional, academic, and intellectual contexts. We're talking about the language used in boardroom negotiations, where millions hang in the balance, philosophical debates that challenge fundamental assumptions, scientific presentations that push the boundaries of human knowledge, and cultural critiques that dissect the complexities of modern society. This isn't simplified learner English. This is authentic, unfiltered discourse featuring rapid speech, complex syntax, sophisticated vocabulary, cultural allusions, implied meanings, and the kind of nuanced argumentation that requires not just linguistic competence, but intellectual agility. You'll experience overlapping speakers, interruptions, technical jargon, abstract concepts, and the messy reality of how highly educated native speakers actually communicate when they're not censoring themselves for language learners. But here's why this challenge matters. Mastering this level of listening comprehension is what transforms you from someone who speaks English well into someone who thinks and operates seamlessly in English-speaking environments. It's the difference between being understood and being taken seriously as an intellectual equal. Today's journey includes 3 progressively challenging sections: high-stakes professional scenarios, rigorous academic discourse, and sophisticated cultural analysis. Each section will test different dimensions of your advanced listening skills while exposing you to the kind of English that opens doors to the highest levels of international academia and business. Are you ready to discover what true mastery feels like? Let's begin. We begin with a corporate board meeting where 2 technology companies are negotiating a complex merger. Notice the interplay of diplomacy and aggression, the coded language, and how speakers use indirect communication to maintain relationships while pursuing conflicting interests. Chairman Reynolds: Thank you all for convening on such short notice. The urgency of Meridian Tech's proposal necessitates immediate deliberation, though I trust we'll maintain our characteristic thoroughness despite the compressed timeline. CEO Harrison, Megacorp: Jim, I appreciate the expedited process, but let's be unambiguous about the stakes here. We're not just discussing a merger, we're contemplating a fundamental restructuring of the competitive landscape in enterprise software. The ramifications extend far beyond our immediate stakeholders. CEO Martinez, Meridian Tech: Michael, while I share your concern for stakeholder impact, I'd argue that market consolidation is inevitable in our sector. The question isn't whether this transformation will occur, but whether we'll be architects of change or casualties of inaction. CFO Davidson, Megacorp: Elena raises a compelling point about market dynamics, but the financial modeling raises some significant red flags. The synergies we're projecting, particularly the 40% reduction in operational redundancies, these figures strike me as overly optimistic, bordering on aspirational. Elena Martinez. Robert, I understand your skepticism regarding the synergy projections. However, our analysis incorporates actual performance data from comparable integrations, not theoretical calculations. The operational efficiencies aren't speculative. They're based on empirical evidence from similar consolidations in adjacent markets. Chief Legal Counsel Thompson. If I may interject, the regulatory landscape presents considerable complexities that haven't been adequately addressed in our preliminary discussions. The Justice Department's recent antitrust initiatives suggest heightened scrutiny for transactions of this magnitude, particularly in technology sectors with concentrated market shares. Chairman Reynolds. Sarah, what's your assessment of the regulatory timeline? Are we looking at a standard review process, or should we anticipate protracted negotiations with multiple regulatory bodies? Sarah Thompson. Based on recent precedents, I'd characterize this as falling into the category of transactions requiring enhanced due diligence. We're likely looking at a 12 to 18-month approval process, assuming no unexpected complications arise. The European regulators will undoubtedly conduct parallel investigations, which could extend the timeline further. Michael Harrison. The extended regulatory timeline introduces substantial execution risk. Market conditions could shift dramatically over 18 months, potentially undermining the strategic rationale for the merger entirely. Alina, how do you propose we mitigate this temporal uncertainty? Michael, that's precisely why we're advocating for a collar structure with indexed valuations tied to performance metrics rather than static pricing. If market conditions deteriorate, the valuation adjusts accordingly. If they improve, both parties benefit proportionally. CFO Davidson, Megacorp. The collar mechanism is intellectually appealing, but it introduces implementation complexities that could prove problematic. How do we reconcile disparate accounting methodologies? How do we address the inevitable disputes over performance attribution? These aren't trivial technical considerations. Head of Strategy, Williams. Robert raises valid operational concerns, but perhaps we're overcomplicating the structural elements. The fundamental question remains whether this combination creates sustainable competitive advantages that justify the inherent integration risks and regulatory uncertainty. Elena Martinez. David, the competitive advantages are demonstrable and substantial. We're not merely aggregating existing capabilities, we're creating entirely new service offerings that neither organization could develop independently within relevant market timeframes. Chairman Reynolds. Alina, when you reference entirely new service offerings, are you referring to the AI-enhanced analytics platform, or are there additional innovations that haven't been disclosed in the preliminary presentations? Jim, the AI platform represents the most visible innovation, but the deeper value proposition lies in the convergence of our respective data architectures. The combined dataset creates network effects that exponentially enhance predictive capabilities across multiple customer segments. Michael Harrison. The technological synergies are compelling, but I remain concerned about cultural integration challenges. Our organizations have fundamentally different approaches to innovation management, talent retention, and customer relationship development. How do we prevent culture clash from undermining the technical advantages we're pursuing? Head of HR, Kumar. Michael's cultural concerns are well-founded. Our preliminary assessments reveal significant disparities in organizational structures, compensation philosophies, and decision-making protocols. However, these differences could prove complementary rather than contradictory if managed strategically. Priya makes an excellent point about complementary cultures. In fact, our due diligence suggests that the cultural differences create opportunities for hybrid approaches that could prove more effective than either organization's current methodologies. Chairman Reynolds: This has been an illuminating initial discussion, but we clearly need more granular analysis before reaching any definitive conclusions. I suggest we establish working groups to address the specific concerns raised: regulatory strategy, financial modeling, cultural integration, and technological convergence. Sarah Thompson: Jim, given the confidentiality requirements and the complexity of the issues, I'd recommend limiting working group participation to essential personnel and implementing enhanced information security protocols throughout the evaluation process. Michael Harrison: Agreed. We also need to establish clear decision-making timelines and communication protocols. The market won't wait indefinitely for our deliberations, and speculation about potential transactions can create its own complications. Elena Martinez: Michael, we're fully aligned on the need for expeditious but thorough evaluation. Perhaps we could reconvene in 10 days with preliminary working group findings and a more detailed implementation timeline. 10 days for preliminary findings seems reasonable, assuming we can maintain the necessary confidentiality while conducting accelerated due diligence. Let's adjourn for now and reconvene with more definitive data and recommendations. Notice how this conversation demonstrates advanced business English. Indirect communication strategies, technical financial vocabulary, diplomatic disagreement, and the complex dance of high-stakes negotiations where every word carries strategic weight. Next, we move to international diplomacy, a climate summit where national representatives negotiate binding emissions targets. Observe the multilateral complexity, the tension between national interests and global imperatives, and the sophisticated rhetoric required for international consensus building. Secretary General Morrison: Distinguished colleagues, we reconvene this afternoon with the sobering recognition that our negotiations have reached a critical juncture. The scientific evidence presented by the IPCC delegation this morning leaves no room for equivocation. The window for maintaining global temperature increases below 1.5 degrees Celsius is rapidly closing. Ambassador Chen, China: Secretary General Morrison, while China acknowledges the urgency conveyed by the scientific community, we must also acknowledge the practical realities constraining developing economies. The proposed emissions reduction targets, however scientifically justified, risk undermining economic development trajectories for nations still lifting populations out of poverty. Minister Johansson, Sweden: Ambassador Chen, with respect, the economic development argument, while historically valid, becomes increasingly untenable when weighed against existential climate risks. The Nordic countries' experience demonstrates that aggressive emissions reductions can coincide with sustained economic growth when coupled with strategic investments in renewable technologies. Ambassador Patel, India: Minister Johansson, the Nordic experience, while admirable, reflects economic and geographical circumstances that don't translate seamlessly to developing economies with entirely different infrastructure legacies, population densities, and industrial requirements. India supports ambitious climate action, but within frameworks that acknowledge differentiated responsibilities and capabilities. Secretary of State Williams: Ambassador Patel raises legitimate concerns about differentiated responsibilities, but we must also recognize that current atmospheric CO2 concentrations reflect cumulative emissions from all sources, regardless of their historical or geographical origins. The atmosphere doesn't distinguish between emissions based on developmental status. Ambassador Dubois, France: Secretary Williams, while scientifically accurate, that perspective risks overlooking the fundamental equity principles that must underpin any sustainable international agreement. The European Union supports aggressive emissions targets, but coupled with technology transfer mechanisms and climate financing that enable developing countries to leapfrog carbon-intensive development pathways. Minister Okafor, Nigeria: Ambassador Dubois, the technology transfer commitments made in previous agreements have largely failed to materialize at the scale and speed necessary for meaningful impact. Nigeria and other African nations require concrete implementation mechanisms with enforceable timelines, not additional aspirational commitments. Ambassador Chen, Minister Okafor identifies a crucial implementation deficit that undermines confidence in multilateral climate frameworks. China proposes binding technology transfer requirements with measurable targets and financial penalties for non-compliance by developed nations. Secretary of State Williams, Ambassador Chen, while the United States supports technology transfer acceleration, binding penalties introduce sovereignty concerns that could prove counterproductive. We prefer incentive-based mechanisms that encourage voluntary compliance through competitive advantages rather than punitive measures. Prime Minister Cele, Brazil, Secretary Williams, voluntary mechanisms have proven insufficient for addressing the scale and urgency of climate challenges. Brazil supports mandatory frameworks, but with recognition that forest conservation and carbon sequestration represent equivalent contributions to emissions reduction targets. Minister Johansson, Prime Minister Cele, forest conservation is undoubtedly crucial, but accounting methodologies for natural carbon sequestration remain problematic. How do we ensure permanence of forest carbon storage? How do we address leakage effects when conservation in one region drives deforestation in another? Ambassador Patel, Minister Johansson raises valid technical concerns, but these accounting challenges shouldn't preclude recognition of natural climate solutions. India proposes hybrid approaches, combining verifiable emissions reductions with scientifically validated sequestration credits subject to enhanced monitoring and verification protocols. Secretary General Morrison, the technical complexities Ambassador Patel references highlight the need for enhanced scientific coordination alongside political negotiations. Perhaps we should consider establishing a permanent technical advisory body with real-time monitoring capabilities and dispute resolution authority. Ambassador Dubois, Secretary General Morrison, the institutional proposal has merit, but institutional effectiveness depends on political will and financial resources. The European Union would support such a body contingent on guaranteed funding commitments and operational independence from political interference. Minister Okafor, Ambassador Dubois, institutional independence is crucial, but we must ensure developing country representation in governance structures. African nations won't support technical bodies dominated by developed countries, regardless of funding commitments or operational mandates. Secretary of State Williams, Minister Okafor's governance concerns are legitimate. The United States proposes rotating leadership with weighted voting that reflects both financial contributions and vulnerability to climate impacts, ensuring that those most affected by climate change have proportional influence over mitigation strategies. Ambassador Chen, Secretary Williams, weighted voting mechanisms risk perpetuating existing power imbalances rather than addressing them. China supports consensus-based decision-making with enhanced consultation requirements for major policy decisions affecting developing countries. Prime Minister Cele, Ambassador Chen, consensus requirements could paralyze decision-making when urgent action is required. Brazil supports qualified majority voting with minority protection provisions and mandatory impact assessments for developing countries. Secretary General Morrison, these governance discussions highlight the fundamental tension between effectiveness and legitimacy in international institutions. Perhaps we should focus on areas where consensus already exists and build institutional trust through successful implementation of limited but achievable targets. Minister Johansson, Secretary General Morrison, the incremental approach has merit, but scientific evidence suggests we may not have the luxury of gradual consensus building. Climate tipping points operate independently of political timelines, and institutional trust becomes irrelevant if we exceed critical temperature thresholds. Ambassador Patel, Minister Johansson's urgency is well-founded, but institutional legitimacy affects implementation capacity. Agreements without broad-based support risk becoming aspirational documents rather than operational frameworks, potentially undermining long-term climate action rather than accelerating it. Secretary General Morrison, this tension between urgency and legitimacy appears to be a recurring theme in our negotiations. I suggest we adjourn today's session and reconvene tomorrow with more specific proposals for addressing both the scientific imperatives and the political realities that constrain our options. This diplomatic exchange illustrates the sophisticated discourse required for international negotiations: multilateral perspective-taking, technical precision, diplomatic euphemisms, and the complex balance between national interests and global imperatives. Our final professional scenario takes us to an academic conference where leading experts debate the ethical implications of artificial intelligence. Notice the interdisciplinary complexity, the theoretical sophistication, and the way experts navigate disagreements while building on each other's arguments. Moderator, Professor Martinez. Good afternoon, colleagues. Today's panel addresses one of the most pressing intellectual challenges of our era: the ethical frameworks necessary for governing artificial intelligence systems that increasingly influence fundamental aspects of human experience. Our distinguished panelists bring perspectives from philosophy, computer science, law, and cognitive science to bear on these complex questions. Professor Chen, Philosophy, Oxford. Thank you, Maria. I'd like to begin by challenging a fundamental assumption that often underlies these discussions: the notion that we can develop ethical frameworks for AI systems independently of broader questions about moral agency, consciousness, and the nature of responsibility itself. The question isn't simply how to make AI systems behave ethically, but whether our existing ethical categories are adequate for entities that may possess forms of intelligence that are fundamentally alien to human cognitive architectures. Dr. Williams, Computer Science, MIT. Angela raises fascinating ontological questions, but from an engineering perspective, we face more immediate practical challenges. Current AI systems, regardless of their ultimate metaphysical status, are already making decisions that affect human welfare in domains ranging from healthcare to criminal justice. We need actionable ethical frameworks now, not after we resolve fundamental questions about machine consciousness that may remain intractable for decades. Professor Johnson, Law, Harvard. David's pragmatic concerns are well taken, but legal frameworks require conceptual clarity about agency and responsibility that Angela's philosophical analysis suggests we currently lack. How do we assign liability for decisions made by systems whose decision-making processes are opaque even to their creators? How do we ensure due process when algorithmic decisions affect fundamental rights but operate through mechanisms that resist human comprehension? Dr. Patel, Cognitive Science, Stanford. Margaret's legal concerns highlight a crucial epistemological challenge. Our ethical and legal frameworks assume forms of transparency and accountability that may be incompatible with the distributed, emergent decision-making processes characteristic of advanced AI systems. The human cognitive biases that shape our notions of fairness and responsibility may prove systematically inadequate for evaluating AI behavior. Professor Chen. Priya's point about cognitive biases is particularly salient because it suggests that the problem isn't simply technical but involves fundamental limitations in human moral reasoning itself. If our ethical intuitions evolved for evaluating other humans in small-scale social contexts, how reliable are those intuitions for evaluating systems that operate at scales and speeds that exceed human cognitive capacities? Dr. Williams, Angela, while acknowledging the limitations of human moral reasoning, we shouldn't let philosophical perfectionism paralyze practical action. Engineering ethics has always involved working with imperfect frameworks and iteratively improving them based on empirical outcomes. We can begin with existing ethical principles, beneficence, non-maleficence, autonomy, justice, and adapt them based on experience with AI systems. Professor Johnson. David's iterative approach has merit, but legal systems require predictability and consistency that iterative adaptation may undermine. Moreover, the stakes of getting AI ethics wrong, particularly in domains like autonomous weapons or predictive policing, may be too high for experimental approaches that treat human welfare as data points in iterative improvement processes. Dr. Patel, Margaret raises crucial concerns about stakes and experimentation, but cognitive science research suggests that human decision-making in high-stakes domains is already significantly flawed. Studies of judicial decision-making, medical diagnosis, and financial risk assessment reveal systematic biases and inconsistencies that AI systems might actually improve upon, even if those systems aren't perfect. Professor Martinez. Priya's observation about human decision-making flaws raises interesting questions about comparative ethics. Should we evaluate AI systems against idealized human decision-making or against actual human performance, including our cognitive limitations and systematic biases? Professor Chen. Maria's question touches on a fundamental normative issue, whether the goal is to replicate human moral reasoning or to transcend its limitations. If human moral reasoning is systematically flawed, perhaps we should aspire to AI systems that make better moral decisions than humans typically do, even if those decisions don't align with human moral intuitions. Dr. Williams. Angela's transcendence approach is intellectually appealing, but practically problematic. AI systems that make moral decisions incomprehensible to humans raise democratic legitimacy concerns, particularly when those systems affect public policy or legal proceedings. Citizens in democratic societies have rights to understand and contest decisions that affect them.
Professor Johnson, David's democratic concerns are well-founded, but they may conflict with effectiveness concerns. If AI systems can make more accurate medical diagnoses or more equitable resource allocation decisions than human experts, do we have moral obligations to use those systems even if their decision-making processes aren't fully transparent to affected parties?
Dr. Patel, Margaret's question highlights tensions between different ethical principles: transparency versus effectiveness, human agency versus optimal outcomes. Cognitive science research suggests that humans often prefer explanations that feel satisfying over explanations that are actually accurate, which complicates efforts to make AI decision-making more comprehensible.
Professor Martinez, these tensions between transparency and effectiveness, human agency and optimal outcomes seem to recur throughout our discussion. Are these irreconcilable conflicts, or might there be synthesis approaches that honor multiple values simultaneously?
Professor Chen, Maria's question about synthesis is crucial because it suggests that the either-or framing may itself be problematic. Perhaps we need meta-ethical frameworks that can navigate trade-offs between competing values contextually, rather than establishing universal hierarchies among ethical principles.
Dr. Williams, Angela's meta-ethical approach resonates with engineering design principles where optimization requires balancing multiple objectives simultaneously. We might develop AI systems with configurable ethical parameters that allow different stakeholders to prioritize different values based on context and application domain.
Professor Johnson, David's configurable approach is intriguing, but raises questions about who gets to configure ethical parameters and based on what authority. Democratic input into AI ethics might require new institutional mechanisms that don't currently exist in most political systems.
Margaret's institutional concerns suggest that AI ethics isn't just a technical or philosophical challenge, but a fundamentally political one, requiring new forms of collective decision-making and democratic participation that account for cognitive limitations and systematic biases in human judgment.
This observation about the political dimensions of AI ethics seems like an appropriate point for wrapping up today's discussion. The complexity of these issues clearly requires continued interdisciplinary collaboration and public engagement as these technologies continue to evolve.
This academic panel demonstrates the highest levels of intellectual discourse, theoretical sophistication, interdisciplinary synthesis, nuanced argumentation, and the ability to build complex ideas collaboratively while maintaining scholarly disagreement.
We transition now to pure academic discourse, a graduate philosophy seminar examining consciousness and personal identity. This represents English at its most abstract and intellectually demanding, requiring not just linguistic competence but philosophical sophistication. Professor Davidson, today we're examining Derek Parfit's reductionist account of personal identity and its implications for moral responsibility, particularly as articulated in Reasons and Persons. I'd like to begin by considering whether Parfit's psychological continuity criterion can adequately address the persistence of moral agency across time, especially in light of recent neuroscientific evidence about the constructed nature of autobiographical memory. Graduate student Cele. Professor Davidson, if we accept Parfit's claim that personal identity is fundamentally illusory, that what we consider the unified self is actually a series of connected but distinct psychological states, doesn't this undermine not just moral responsibility, but the entire phenomenological structure of conscious experience itself? Professor Davidson, Cele raises a crucial phenomenological objection. The felt sense of unified consciousness does seem to resist Parfit's reductionist analysis, but we need to distinguish between the phenomenology of selfhood and its ontological status. The persistence of selfhood as an experienced phenomenon doesn't necessarily vindicate its metaphysical reality. Graduate student Marcus. But Professor Davidson, doesn't that distinction between phenomenology and ontology presuppose a problematic dualism? If consciousness is fundamentally embodied, as enactivist cognitive science suggests, then the phenomenological unity of experience might be constitutive of personal identity rather than merely epiphenomenal. Visiting scholar Dr. Chen. Marcus's enactivist approach is intriguing, but it may conflate different levels of analysis. The embodied nature of cognition doesn't necessarily support strong claims about personal identity persistence. Neural plasticity research suggests that even embodied cognitive processes are subject to continuous reconstruction that might undermine rather than support identity persistence. Dr. Chen, but if we take embodiment seriously, we can't treat neural plasticity as undermining identity persistence without falling into a reductive physicalism that ignores the emergent properties of consciousness. The enactivist approach suggests that identity emerges from dynamic coupling between organism and environment rather than residing in static neural configurations. Professor Davidson, Cele's emergentist account is sophisticated, but it faces what I call the grain problem. If identity is emergent from dynamic processes, at what temporal and spatial scales does this emerge? Are we conscious beings, or conscious moments, or conscious events? The boundaries seem arbitrary. Graduate student Marcus. Professor Davidson, the grain problem might actually support rather than undermine emergentist approaches. If consciousness operates across multiple temporal scales simultaneously, as global workspace theory suggests, then identity might be scale relative rather than absolute, which could reconcile Parfit's reductionism with phenomenological unity. Professor Davidson, Marcus's scale-relative approach is conceptually appealing, but it raises questions about moral responsibility that seem practically intractable. If identity varies across temporal scales, which scale is relevant for attributing responsibility? Do we hold responsible the person moment, the person day, the person year? Graduate student Jessica. Dr. Chen, perhaps the practical intractability of scale-relative responsibility attributions reveals something important about moral responsibility itself, that it's a pragmatic construction rather than a metaphysical fact. This might align with Strawson's reactive attitudes approach better than traditional desert-based theories. Professor Davidson, Jessica's Strawsonian move is clever, but it may collapse into relativism if moral responsibility becomes purely pragmatic. How do we distinguish legitimate from illegitimate responsibility attributions if the criteria are contextual rather than metaphysically grounded? Dr. Chen, but doesn't the metaphysical grounding approach face equally serious problems? If consciousness research reveals that unified agency is neurologically illusory, defending traditional responsibility concepts may require ignoring empirical evidence in favor of folk psychological intuitions. Dr. Chen, Sarah's empirical challenge is significant, but we should be cautious about deriving normative conclusions from descriptive neuroscience. The naturalistic fallacy applies here. The fact that neuroscience reveals consciousness to be constructed doesn't automatically entail that moral responsibility is illegitimate. Graduate student Marcus. Dr. Chen, but if we're really committed to naturalism, shouldn't our moral concepts be revisable in light of empirical discoveries? The persistence of folk psychological concepts, despite scientific disconfirmation, might reflect cognitive conservatism rather than philosophical insight. Graduate student Jessica. Marcus, that assumes a problematic hierarchy between scientific and moral discourse. Maybe the right approach is what Sellers called stereoscopic vision, finding ways to integrate scientific and manifest images rather than privileging one over the other. Professor Davidson. Jessica's Sellarsian approach is appealing, but integration requires commensurable conceptual frameworks. If consciousness science and moral responsibility involve incommensurable vocabularies, integration might be impossible rather than merely difficult. Dr. Chen. Professor Davidson, the incommensurability worry might be overstated. Recent work in moral psychology suggests that our responsibility practices are more flexible and context-sensitive than traditional philosophical theories suggest, which might provide resources for integration. Graduate student Sarah. Dr. Chen, but if responsibility practices are that flexible, don't we risk losing any normative constraints? Without some principled basis for responsibility attributions, moral evaluation becomes arbitrary power assertion rather than legitimate normative assessment. Graduate student Marcus. Sarah, maybe that's not a bug but a feature. If power relations are inevitable in moral evaluation, acknowledging them explicitly might be more honest than pretending that responsibility attributions are politically neutral metaphysical discoveries. Professor Davidson. Marcus's political analysis is thought-provoking, but it seems to conflate descriptive and normative claims about power. The fact that responsibility attributions involve power relations doesn't necessarily delegitimize the normative authority of those attributions. Graduate student Jessica. Professor Davidson, but if we take seriously the idea that moral concepts are historically and culturally variable, as genealogical approaches suggest, then claims about normative authority might reflect parochial assumptions rather than universal truths. Dr. Chen. Jessica's genealogical approach raises important questions about moral epistemology, but it may be self-undermining. If all normative claims reflect parochial assumptions, doesn't that include the genealogical critique itself? Dr. Chen, the self-reference problem with genealogical critiques is real, but it might point toward a more modest conclusion, that normative claims require local justification rather than universal grounding, which is compatible with fallibilistic but non-relativistic moral epistemology. This has been a characteristically rich discussion that's opened more questions than it's answered, which is perhaps appropriate for these fundamental issues. For next week, I'd like you to read Shoemaker's Self, Body, and Coincidence and consider whether psychological continuity theories can accommodate the embodiment insights we've discussed today. This philosophical seminar exemplifies academic English at its most demanding: abstract conceptual analysis, sophisticated argumentation, technical philosophical vocabulary, and the ability to engage with multiple theoretical frameworks simultaneously. Scientific research presentation. Quantum computing breakthrough. Next, we encounter cutting-edge scientific discourse, a research presentation announcing a quantum computing breakthrough. Notice the technical precision, the complexity of explaining revolutionary concepts, and the interplay between theoretical sophistication and practical implications. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, thank you for attending this special session. Today, I'll present findings from our collaboration with IBM Research and the University of Vienna that we believe represent a fundamental breakthrough in quantum error correction, Specifically, the demonstration of logical qubit coherence times exceeding 1 millisecond using novel topological stabilizer codes implemented on superconducting quantum processors. To contextualize these results, consider that quantum computing's transformative potential has been constrained by decoherence, the tendency of quantum states to deteriorate through environmental interaction. Current superconducting qubits maintain coherence for microseconds, insufficient for meaningful quantum algorithms requiring thousands of logical operations. Our approach leverages topological quantum error correction, where logical qubits are encoded in non-local properties of many-body quantum systems that are inherently protected against local perturbations. Think of it as distributed quantum information storage that's robust against individual component failures. Audience member, Dr. Rodriguez. Dr. Chen, topological approaches have been theoretically promising for decades, but experimental implementations has faced insurmountable fabrication challenges. How did your team overcome the precision requirements for creating and manipulating anionic excitations in condensed matter systems? Dr. Chen, excellent question, Miguel. Rather than attempting to fabricate naturally occurring topological phases, we've implemented effective topological protection using surface codes with carefully engineered noise correlations. By introducing controlled environmental coupling that creates spatially correlated decoherence patterns, we've achieved quantum error correction thresholds comparable to theoretical topological systems. Dr. Tanaka, audience. The correlation engineering approach is ingenious, but doesn't introduced environmental coupling inherently increase decoherence rates? How do you reconcile enhanced protection with increased noise? Dr. Tanaka, that's the counterintuitive aspect of our results. While total decoherence rates increase, the spatial correlation structure enables dramatically more efficient error correction. The syndrome extraction process becomes deterministic rather than probabilistic, reducing the quantum overhead required for fault-tolerant computation. Dr. Patel, audience. Dr. Chen, could you elaborate on the syndrome extraction improvements? Traditional quantum error correction requires exponential overhead scaling, which has been a fundamental obstacle to practical quantum computing. Absolutely, Dr. Patel. In conventional approaches, syndrome measurements introduce additional decoherence while extracting error information. Our correlated noise protocol enables passive syndrome readout through environmental monitoring, eliminating measurement-induced decoherence while maintaining full error correction capability. Dr. Williams, audience. The passive syndrome readout is fascinating, but I'm concerned about scalability. How does the environmental correlation engineering scale with system size? Are we looking at polynomial or exponential resource requirements? Dr. Williams, scalability is indeed crucial. Our theoretical analysis suggests polynomial scaling with favorable constants. We've demonstrated the protocol on 12-qubit systems, and projected resource requirements for 1,000-qubit systems remain within engineering feasibility bounds, assuming continued progress in superconducting fabrication precision. Dr. Zhang, Dr. Chen, what are the implications for quantum algorithm implementation? Do existing quantum algorithms map naturally onto your topologically protected logical qubits, or are algorithmic modifications required? Dr. Chen, that's where things become particularly exciting. The enhanced coherence times enable implementation of variational quantum algorithms that were previously impractical due to decoherence limitations. We've successfully implemented quantum approximate optimization algorithms with circuit depths exceeding 1,000 gates, unprecedented for near-term quantum devices. The algorithmic implications are remarkable, but I'm curious about the physical implementation details. You mentioned superconducting processors. Are you using transmon qubits, flux qubits, or novel architectures specifically designed for topological protection? Miguel, we're using modified transmon architectures with additional coupling circuitry that enables the correlated environmental interactions. The key innovation involves engineered dissipation channels that create non-local quantum correlations while preserving computational basis state coherence. The engineered dissipation approach is conceptually appealing, but engineering specific environmental correlations seems technically formidable. What fabrication tolerances are required, and how robust is the protection against parameter variations? Dr. Tanaka, fabrication requirements are demanding but achievable with current lithographic precision. Parameter sensitivity analysis indicates robustness margins of approximately 10%, which provides sufficient engineering tolerance for reliable device operation. Dr. Patel, looking toward practical applications, what quantum advantage demonstrations become feasible with millisecond coherence times? Are we approaching the threshold for quantum supremacy in commercially relevant problems? Dr. Patel, millisecond coherence enables quantum algorithms with complexity beyond classical simulation capabilities for systems exceeding 50 logical qubits. We're targeting optimization problems in logistics, drug discovery, and material science, where quantum advantage could provide substantial economic value. The commercial implications are intriguing, but transitioning from laboratory demonstrations to practical quantum computers involves significant engineering challenges. What's your roadmap for scaling to fault-tolerant quantum computers with millions of logical qubits? Dr. Williams, our 10-year roadmap involves incremental scaling through improved fabrication processes and enhanced error correction protocols. The immediate goal is demonstrating quantum advantage in specific application domains, followed by gradual expansion to general-purpose fault-tolerant quantum computation. Dr. Zhang, competition in quantum computing is intense, with significant investments from technology companies and governments worldwide. How does your approach compare with alternative paradigms like trapped ion systems, photonic quantum computing, or neutral atom platforms? Dr. Zhang, each platform has distinctive advantages and limitations. Trapped ions offer superior coherence but limited connectivity. Photonic systems enable room temperature operation but face scalability challenges. Our superconducting approach with topological protection combines the fabrication maturity of superconducting circuits with coherence times approaching trapped ion performance. Dr. Rodriguez, the intellectual property landscape in quantum computing is becoming increasingly complex. How do licensing considerations affect the commercial viability of topological quantum error correction approaches? Miguel, intellectual property is indeed a significant consideration. Our approach builds on fundamental theoretical work that remains in the public domain, though specific implementation techniques are proprietary. We're pursuing open licensing strategies that encourage ecosystem development while protecting core innovations. Dr. Tanaka, regulatory and security considerations for quantum computing are evolving rapidly, particularly regarding cryptographic implications. How do these policy dimensions affect research priorities and commercial development strategies? Dr. Tanaka, policy considerations increasingly influence both research directions and commercialization timelines. We're collaborating with standards organizations and regulatory bodies to ensure responsible development while maintaining technological leadership. The cryptographic implications require careful balance between innovation and security considerations. Moderator, Dr. Chen, we're approaching our time limit, but perhaps you could offer concluding thoughts about the broader implications of this breakthrough for the quantum computing field. Thank you. I believe we're witnessing an inflection point where quantum computing transitions from promising laboratory science to practical computational tool. The coherence improvements we've demonstrated enable meaningful quantum algorithms while maintaining engineering feasibility. This suggests that quantum advantage in specialized applications may emerge sooner than previously anticipated, though general-purpose quantum computers remain a longer-term aspiration requiring continued fundamental advances. This scientific presentation demonstrates the precision and complexity required for cutting-edge research communication, technical accuracy, theoretical sophistication, practical considerations, and the ability to explain revolutionary concepts to expert audiences. Our final academic segment features a historical analysis lecture comparing imperial systems across different civilizations and time periods. Notice the sophisticated analytical frameworks, the complex comparative methodology, and the nuanced treatment of historical evidence. Professor Williams, today we examine what I term imperial convergence patterns. The remarkable similarities in administrative structures, economic policies, and cultural strategies that emerge across geographically and temporally distinct imperial systems, from the Roman Empire to the Qing dynasty to the British Empire. Traditional historiography has emphasized the uniqueness of imperial formations, but comparative analysis reveals striking structural parallels that suggest underlying dynamics of imperial governance that transcend specific cultural contexts. This convergent evolution in imperial administration raises fundamental questions about the relationship between power, territory, and cultural diversity that remain relevant for understanding contemporary geopolitical arrangements. Consider the administrative challenge common to all successful empires, governing culturally heterogeneous populations across vast territories with limited communication technologies. The Roman solution involved standardized legal frameworks combined with cultural accommodation. Roman law provided universal governance, while local customs were preserved in non-essential domains. The Qing dynasty faced analogous challenges, governing Han Chinese, Mongols, Tibetans, and numerous other ethnic groups. Their solution involved what modern scholars term multi-ethnic imperial ideology, a hierarchical system that preserved cultural distinctions while integrating diverse populations into unified administrative structures. The British Empire, despite different historical circumstances, developed remarkably similar strategies. Indirect rule that preserved local power structures while imposing unified legal and economic frameworks, combined with cultural policies that accommodated diversity within imperial unity. These convergent patterns suggest that imperial governance involves universal challenges that generate similar institutional responses despite radically different cultural contexts. The implications extend beyond historical analysis to contemporary questions about globalization, international governance, and the management of cultural diversity within political unions. However, we must also examine where imperial systems diverged, particularly in their approaches to cultural assimilation versus accommodation. The Roman Empire ultimately pursued cultural homogenization through citizenship extension and Latin language promotion. The Qing dynasty maintained explicit ethnic hierarchies while preserving cultural boundaries. The British Empire developed hybrid approaches that varied significantly across different colonial contexts. These divergent strategies reflect different theories of imperial legitimacy and different assumptions about the relationship between cultural unity and political stability. Understanding these variations provides insights into the different ways political systems can manage diversity and the different outcomes these approaches produce over time. The collapse patterns of imperial systems also reveal important convergences. Economic overextension, administrative corruption, military overcommitment, and challenges from emerging competitor powers appear as recurring themes across different imperial formations. This suggests that imperial systems may face inherent structural limitations that eventually undermine their stability regardless of their specific cultural characteristics. Contemporary relevance of these historical patterns extend to questions about American hegemony, European integration, Chinese global influence, and other modern forms of trans-territorial governance that exhibit imperial characteristics while operating within different ideological frameworks. This historical lecture demonstrates advanced academic discourse, comparative analytical frameworks, sophisticated theoretical synthesis, historical evidence evaluation, and the ability to draw connections between historical patterns and contemporary issues. Literary Criticism Roundtable: Post-Colonial Perspectives. We conclude with Sophisticated Cultural Analysis, a literary criticism roundtable examining post-colonial perspectives in contemporary literature. This represents the intersection of literary sophistication, cultural theory, and critical analysis that characterizes advanced humanities discourse. Moderator Dr. Reyes. Tonight, we're examining how contemporary writers from formerly colonized societies are reimagining narrative structures, linguistic practices, and cultural representation in ways that challenge Western literary conventions while creating new forms of aesthetic expression. Our panelists bring perspectives from comparative literature, cultural studies, and creative writing. Professor Okafor, I'd like to begin by interrogating the term post-colonial itself, which has become simultaneously indispensable and problematic in literary analysis. The prefix post suggests a temporal progression beyond colonialism, but this teleological assumption obscures the ways colonial power structures persist in literary institutions, publishing networks, and aesthetic hierarchies that continue to shape how non-Western literature is produced, distributed, and consumed. Dr. Chakraborty, Amara raises crucial concerns about periodization and power structures that resonate with my work on South Asian literature. Writers like Amitav Ghosh and Kiran Desai aren't simply writing after colonialism. They're navigating literary markets where Western aesthetic categories continue to determine commercial viability and critical recognition. The challenge becomes creating authentic cultural expression within institutions that remain fundamentally shaped by colonial epistemologies. Professor Martinez, Ravi's point about institutional constraints connects to broader questions about linguistic authenticity in post-colonial literature. When writers like Ngugi wa Thiong'o advocate for indigenous language literature, they're challenging not just linguistic imperialism, but the entire infrastructure of global literary circulation that privileges European languages. Yet writers who choose English or French aren't necessarily compromising authenticity. They may be strategically appropriating imperial languages for anti-imperial purposes. Dr. Williams, Elena's observation about strategic appropriation highlights the complexity of agency within constrained choices. Writers like Gloria Anzaldúa, who code-switch between Spanish and English within single texts, create what Homi Bhabha terms hybrid literary forms that resist easy categorization within traditional literary taxonomies. These linguistic strategies suggest new aesthetic possibilities that emerge from cultural contact rather than existing despite it. Professor Okafor, James raises important questions about hybridity, but we must be cautious about celebrating cultural mixing without examining power differentials. When metropolitan critics praise hybrid aesthetics, they may be unconsciously replicating colonial dynamics that valued cultural difference only when it's been safely domesticated for Western consumption. The challenge is distinguishing between genuine innovation and what might be called exotic post-colonialism that confirms rather than challenges Western expectations. Dr. Chakraborty, Amara's concern about exotic post-colonialism resonates with recent debates about world literature as a category that may inadvertently reproduce hierarchical relationships between center and periphery. When Western universities create world literature curricula, the selection criteria often reflect Western pedagogical assumptions about what constitutes universal human experience, potentially marginalizing literary traditions that don't conform to Western narrative conventions. Professor Martinez, Ravi's critique of world literature curricula points toward larger questions about aesthetic universalism versus cultural specificity. Writers like Chinua Achebe and Gabriel Garcia Marquez achieved international recognition partly by creating works that were simultaneously rooted in specific cultural contexts and accessible to international audiences. But this accessibility may require what some critics call translation, not just linguistically, but culturally, making indigenous cultural practices comprehensible to outsiders in ways that may compromise their authentic complexity. Dr. Williams, Elena's translation metaphor is particularly apt because it highlights how cultural representation involves interpretive choices that inevitably involve loss and transformation. Writers like Leslie Marmon Silko, who incorporates Laguna Pueblo storytelling traditions into contemporary narrative forms, face the challenge of preserving cultural authenticity while making their work accessible to readers unfamiliar with indigenous narrative conventions. Professor Okafor, James's example of Silko raises questions about cultural appropriation versus cultural revitalization that extend beyond individual authorial choices to broader questions about intellectual property and cultural sovereignty. When indigenous narrative traditions are incorporated into literary works that circulate in commercial markets, who benefits from that circulation, and how do we ensure that cultural communities retain control over their own representation practices? Dr. Chakraborty, Amara's sovereignty concerns connects to recent scholarship on decolonizing methodologies in literary studies itself. Scholars like Linda Tuhiwai Smith argue that even well-intentioned academic analysis of indigenous literature may perpetuate colonial knowledge production practices unless indigenous communities participate as equal partners in defining research questions and interpretive frameworks. Professor Martinez, Ravi's point about decolonizing methodologies suggests that literary criticism needs to examine its own institutional practices, not just analyze literary texts. When Western universities hire scholars to teach post-colonial literature, they may be creating academic positions that depend on maintaining the very categories and hierarchies that post-colonial literature seeks to challenge. Dr. Tabakordi, Elena's institutional critique raises uncomfortable questions about academic complicity in systems we claim to critique. Perhaps the solution involves what Gayatri Spivak calls strategic essentialism, temporarily embracing categories like post-colonial literature for practical purposes, while maintaining critical awareness of their limitations and working toward more equitable institutional arrangements. Professor Okafor, James's strategic essentialism approach has merit, but it requires constant vigilance about when strategic compromises become permanent accommodations to unjust systems. The challenge is maintaining transformative vision while operating within existing institutional constraints that may gradually domesticate radical critique through academic institutionalization. Dr. Chakraborty, this tension between transformation and accommodation seems central to contemporary literary production as well. Writers who achieve commercial success within existing publishing systems gain platforms for cultural representation, but may face pressures to repeat successful formulas rather than continuing experimental work that challenges aesthetic conventions. Professor Martinez, Ravi's observation about commercial pressures highlights how market forces interact with aesthetic innovation in complex ways. Publishers' expectations about audience preferences may constrain literary experimentation, but commercial success can also provide resources for more experimental work and create opportunities for other writers from marginalized communities. Moderator Dr. Veyes, these tensions between innovation and constraint, authenticity and accessibility, transformation and accommodation seem to recur throughout our discussion. Perhaps they reflect broader contradictions in how contemporary societies navigate cultural diversity within global economic and institutional systems that retain hierarchical characteristics despite official commitments to equality and inclusion. This literary roundtable exemplifies sophisticated cultural analysis, theoretical sophistication, nuanced argumentation, interdisciplinary synthesis, and the ability to navigate complex questions about culture, power, and representation. Our final segment features a philosophical debate about technology and human flourishing, a contemporary issue that requires both theoretical sophistication and practical wisdom. Notice how philosophical argument engages with empirical evidence while maintaining conceptual rigor. Professor Sterling, tonight's debate examines whether digital technologies enhance or diminish human flourishing, broadly conceived as the realization of distinctively human capacities for reason, creativity, social connection, and moral development. I'll argue that digital technologies, despite obvious instrumental benefits, fundamentally undermine human flourishing by fragmenting attention, commodifying social relationships, and replacing embodied engagement with virtual substitutes. Professor Chen, David's position reflects what I consider a nostalgic romanticism about pre-digital human experience that ignores both the limitations of traditional social arrangements and the genuine enhancements that digital technologies provide for human capabilities. Far from diminishing flourishing, digital technologies expand opportunities for intellectual development, creative expression, and social connection beyond anything previously possible in human history. Professor Sterling, Angela's enhancement thesis overlooks crucial qualitative distinctions between different forms of intellectual, creative, and social engagement. Digital technologies may provide access to more information, but information access doesn't automatically translate into wisdom or understanding. Similarly, digital social connections may increase the quantity of interpersonal contact while diminishing the quality of genuine intimacy and mutual commitment that characterize flourishing social relationships. David's qualitative distinctions assume a problematic hierarchy between supposedly authentic offline experiences and supposedly artificial digital experiences. But this binary ignores how digital technologies can enhance rather than replace embodied engagement. Virtual reality applications in education, telemedicine, and artistic expression create new forms of meaningful experience rather than pale substitutes for traditional activities. Professor Sterling, Angela's examples are compelling in specific domains, but they avoid the broader existential question about how digital technologies reshape fundamental structures of human experience. Constant connectivity creates what Sherry Turkle calls continuous partial attention that prevents the sustained focus necessary for deep intellectual work, contemplative reflection, and meaningful interpersonal engagement. Professor Chen, David's attention fragmentation concern has empirical merit, but it reflects adaptation challenges rather than inherent technological limitations. Just as literacy required developing new cognitive skills for processing written information, digital fluency involves learning to navigate information-rich environments effectively. Research on digital natives suggests that younger generations are developing sophisticated multitasking abilities that may represent cognitive evolution rather than degradation. Professor Sterling, Angela's evolutionary adaptation argument is speculative and potentially dangerous. Even if humans can adapt to digital environments, that doesn't demonstrate that such adaptation promotes flourishing. Cocaine addiction also involves neural adaptation, but we don't conclude that cocaine enhances human well-being. The question isn't whether adaptation is possible, but whether specific adaptations support or undermine distinctively human capabilities. Professor Chen, David's addiction analogy is inflammatory and unproductive. Digital technology use exists on a spectrum from pathological to enhancing, just like any other human activity. The challenge is developing ethical frameworks for distinguishing beneficial from harmful uses rather than rejecting entire technological categories based on their most problematic manifestations. Professor Sterling, Angela's spectrum approach sounds reasonable, but evades fundamental questions about whether digital technologies are inherently compatible with human flourishing. Technologies aren't value-neutral tools. They embody particular assumptions about human nature and social organization that shape their users in ways that may be incompatible with flourishing, regardless of specific usage patterns. Professor Chen, David's non-neutrality thesis has merit, but it applies equally to traditional technologies like writing, printing, and industrial production that fundamentally transformed human societies. The question isn't whether technologies shape human experience, they obviously do, but whether specific transformations enhance or diminish human capabilities over time. Professor Sterling, Angela's historical analogy misses crucial differences between digital technologies and previous technological revolutions. Writing and printing enhanced human memory and